there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Hello, this is Matthew, and welcome to TEFLology, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters. Today, we bring you an interview with Dr. Jane Spiro. Jane works at Oxford Brookes University in the UK, where she is currently a reader in Education and TESOL within the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. She is also the program leader for the MA in Education and TESOL. She is the author of Creative Poetry Writing and Changing Methodologies in TESOL, as well as being a novelist and a poet. Her research interests include teacher narratives, reflective practice, and the connections between being creative practitioners and being educators in language curricula, all topics which are touched upon in this episode's interview. Matt caught up with Jane last November before she was due to present as a featured speaker at the JALT 2015 conference. Please enjoy.
Okay, so thank you very much for joining me today. Just for our listeners, would you mind giving a brief overview of your career to date?
I started teaching English to teenagers coming on holiday to England.
Okay.
On a summer schools,
yes.
On the south coast of England, and that was a very challenging start because many of the children didn't want to be studying at all, would rather be playing football or sitting on the beach. So it was challenging, but it made me realise what a wonderful kind of international world we were entering in language teaching. And I was studying language and literature and was very sort of passionate about those subjects. So I realised that interest in travel, in bringing people together with multiple languages and backgrounds and cultures, and language and culture could all come together in the profession of language teaching. So from there, after graduating, I worked as a lectrice in a Belgian university, and then did my MA and went on to train language teachers in Switzerland, which was a great experience across all the different cantons. And then I had many different British Council sort of short placements in India, Mexico. I was briefly in Japan.
Right.
And that sort of opened out into joining up academic and higher education teaching as well. Many different projects related to the development of course books and resource books, language assessment, literature assessment. Bringing story and poetry into the classroom was always something I kind of specialised in right at the start, and travelled to share and to talk about, and working in projects where the language curriculum was being regenerated, such as the former Soviet countries after 1989, such as India was bringing in Indian literature into the literature curriculum. So. And now I'm at Oxford Brookes University in the School of Education, working on a number of different higher education and international programmes.
I see. Okay. Perhaps we'll come back to the creativity side later, because I'd like to ask you about some of those countries in particular. But you recently published a book called Changing Methodologies in TESOL, which we have here actually, published by Edinburgh University Press.
Yeah.
And very broadly, what changes are at foot currently in our profession, and how are these approached in your book?
Well, I think one of the challenges for teachers is that students are accessing language in so many ways outside the classroom, through digital media, through social networking. They have other ways of learning that are not about learning in a classroom. And so the challenge for a teacher is to either bring that social media and the digital forms of communication into the classroom, or take account of it somehow, keep abreast of it. But the other challenge is that that's variable. It depends on the country, the learner, the context, their own relationship to it, the resources. So it's also not possible to assume that, and there could be many gradations of access to the outside world in that way within one international class. So that's, I think, one challenge. It also means, as a result, there are many Englishes and many ways of understanding what English means and what English is used for. So to find clarity so that meets the needs of learners in the classroom is another huge challenge. What kind of English and what kind of register, what kind of context will it be used, and how might that be adapted? So, for example, notions of correctness are completely revisited as a result of these hybrid languages, somewhere in between text messages, texting, writing and speaking. We create a whole hybrid. So I think it challenges the whole role of what we do as teachers. It could be that learners don't need teachers any longer because they are self-learners. So I think what that then throws onto the profession is what are the value-added skills, competences, strategies which a teacher can frame and prepare, or is it just about providing opportunity, providing ways to structure all the knowledge that a teacher can bring? So I think it's partly that. And from my higher education sort of setting, I can see that higher education in the UK is very much framing values such as being critical, being reflective, being able to prepare for employability. And I think some of those ways of thinking about language teaching are very useful in TESOL too. So bringing into the language learning process, noticing strategies, self-learning strategies, organising skills of self-learning, really, or autonomous learning, have in a way become more critical because of all of these other variables and pressures.
I think one of your chapters was about multiple literacies, and that I guess that feeds into it too.
So absolutely, that's what it's about. That actually learning a language is a lot more than learning the discrete items of language and how they hold together. It's how it sits in the world at large, how it sits in a specific context, how you might vary that in multiple different ways. For the setting, the vehicle, the mode of communication, and the key skill is the literacy to understand those differences and to generate language that's appropriate to know the variations and what does work and what doesn't. And again, that's challenging because that changes all the time as well. What's correct and what isn't changes all the time. We're generating new language all the time, and that is the other challenge, I think, for the teacher, is to keep abreast of what students know, because they're moving faster, and younger people are moving faster than their older teachers in understanding where language is going. So who is teaching who? And I think in a way it's letting go, and for teachers to let go and to say, okay, I'm actually going to learn from my students where new language is coming from.
Do you think it's hard for the English teacher to kind of stay relevant then, I guess? I think
the language teacher has to work hard with their learners to stay relevant by finding out where are you getting language from, how are you accessing it, what new language are you generating, how are you sharing messages now on Twitter and with different characters and different spellings and different sound bites of language. So they have to move with the students, or admit that they need to learn from students and want to move ahead with them. So I think it's more and more a shared enterprise.
I think it's Luke Meddings of the Dogme kind of approach was saying that learners are bringing language to the classroom as opposed to coming for language. So that kind of dichotomy seems relevant, I guess, at the moment.
It's very much so that the teacher has to let go of the idea of being the source of information, or even, the place where the learning begins, the stimulus even, because there are so many other ones which your learners are likely to bring into the classroom.
Right. Yeah. So, and how does that relate to materials or lesson materials that were commonly used in the classroom?
So, I think that a lesson that works needs to bring into the classroom the resources students have and turn that into a way of learning. So, so for them to look things up while you're there, while they are there in the classroom, to compare the knowledge that they're bringing in, and to bring in new language as it's coined, to talk about new words and new associations, to look at and compare the way they use language and different levels of formality of that, and maybe what would have been expected, what in different levels of formalism versus levels of formality and breadth and brevity, in new ways of communicating socially. So I think that has to be part of the lesson. To deny that does make it endanger the teacher to become irrelevant.
I see. Okay, that's interesting. And you're talking about particular teachers in particular, settings. The same book contains different case studies from, for example, Congo, Romania, and Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, we talked about the changing role for the teacher. What's the value of looking at different case studies in order to kind of find out these or answer these questions?
Also, I think it's absolutely critical to, in a methodology book resource session, to look at the differences culturally and see how culturally sensitive a situation might be. So, for example, what I'm saying about access to digital media might be completely appropriate and true in Japan, but completely not so in a sort of small rural area in Sri Lanka, where there might be one mobile phone which is shared by a whole community, and so to make assumptions is always wrong. And I think what the case studies show is that we need to be asking questions as a teacher. What's relevant? What are they doing? What is available? What are the resources? And what can be done to absolutely make the most of that. So for example, in Romania there was a huge move after 1989 for the former Soviet countries to develop their own materials and language course books. And there's quite a lot of funding put into the development of teacher-driven, from their own context, writing course books for their context. But actually that's moved forward as well, because in a way you can ask the question, do you want, did, say, Romanian learners want to only use course books from a Romanian context?
I see.
And was that limiting or was that empowering? And so for some contexts it's limiting. For some, like in Sweden, I've worked with Swedish teachers who developed some wonderful course books from the ground up, as did the Romanian teachers, and they work in Sweden, it's empowering, but to be very sensitive to whether that might then become limiting if they're not accessing international resources, but then to be asking the question, that Dogme does, and Scott Thornbury and Luke Meddings, which is, when we say international, do we really mean Oxford University Press? Do we really mean American and British? So that's the other challenge for teachers, is to constantly be questioning that. What assumptions are we making about the big picture and the local picture? When we talk about the big picture, we're really talking about ourselves. So that's what the case studies are about. It's constantly reminding the teacher, are we really talking about ourselves, or are we really looking at how things are different in different places? Because I think we can overemphasize how things are the same in different places, how methodologies, good methodology is good anywhere, but different settings have different constraints to them.
And I guess in the past, kind of the British Council has been kind of criticised as kind of going in with this very kind of top-down teaching approach. I think there was a lot of examples in India where they kind of came in with this kind of sweeping methodology, and it didn't fully consider the relationship with the local setting, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think it's qualifications like Delta and CELTA, which I think make certain assumptions, for example, that it's a multicultural, multilingual classroom, that the classroom is of a certain ideal size, up to 16, and that the teacher has freedom. So for many state school teachers, that just isn't going to be relevant. No. So if we're looking at what are meant to be international qualifications, we need to look at qualifications which really work across these different contexts.
Do they exist?
No. Well, that would be very interesting to ask that and to work on that. To generating that. And of course, if you work in the state system, you need to be accountable to the state qualification system. But where there isn't, for example, a state qualification system for language teaching, maybe something that's cross-cultural could be a helpful measure or standard. And that standard would include how do you deal with the constraint, say, of having a very, very limited exam syllabus that you have to stick with large classes and monolingual or monocultural classes. How do you deal with that?
Right.
What are the principles of good teaching there? And are they the same as the principles of good teaching in a class of 12 motivated adults in a British Council evening class?
I see, there's a lot of questions to answer.
So that's what the book, Changing Methodologies, why I've used something like 42 case studies to show the differences. To work with what are the core qualities of a good teacher, but also what's the distinctiveness about different classrooms.
Right, I see. Excellent, And in the case studies, you always mention the class size and the kind of the context of the class as well, high school, and that's important.
Really important,
Definitely. Okay. Maybe changing focus now slightly. In 2010, you were awarded the National Teaching Fellowship, partly for your work in creative language education. I wonder if you could maybe explain to our listeners how that came about, and also where were your origins in your interest in creative language education?
Well, I mean, my interest in being creative came before the word interest was in my vocabulary. I began writing when I was 4 years old.
Oh, really? Wow.
And as soon as I could read and write, I was writing poetry and stories. So I have notebooks, and I invented my own language when I was 9 years old, which I still have the notes for, and which I'm going to share at the JALT conference. Maybe that's letting a secret out the bag.
This won't be out for a while, so that's fine.
But I will be doing that. So I've always, as a child, had this fascination for language and the games you can play with language and telling my story. And when I became a teacher, and I realised that the way learners were being taught to read and write did not come from this native spark of inspiration. It came from some much more intellectualized, cerebral place to do with the rhetoric of language, and that the thing that made me a writer from the age of 4 was not inside pedagogy.
I see.
So what I began my search for was how to bring into the classroom that same reason for writing that I had from the age of 4. So I began this reason for writing and ways of writing, mirroring what I had done as a child, or what had worked for me, or what had kept this sustainable interest to try and do the same for learners. So, and that began right in my very first teaching practice when I did my own postgraduate certificate in education. I worked in an inner city school in Haringey in London, and my first group included Turkish Cypriot refugee children, and I felt I can't do the writing activities being required here because these children aren't being given a chance to tell their own story. So I began to try out with them some of the things I had done myself when I was 6 years old. Asking them to tell me words about their memory, to draw pictures of their memories and label them, to draw aspirational pictures of their dreams, and if they were to go home, who would they go back to? And with the vocabulary they had, which was not at that point very much, we could do it. We could work through it visually. We could work through it with mime. And we could work through it with drawings and with words and with bringing objects in, and it just began right then, and I've never really looked back. So it's become an absolute sort of credo of mine, and I then worked to threading that approach into everything at every level. So that was primary level, what I've just described, but I then tried secondary level and then worked with adults, and then threaded it into my work with training teachers, and then into higher education, and now sort of my work on master's programs. So it began to escalate out, and so then in my own writing I had the books with Oxford University Press, and they come out of all of those years of work, and then my own stories for language learners. Some of those have a framework of ways of working with them in the classroom, and so an example is that my first stories for language learners were based on creation myths, which I had been collecting since I was a child as well. So that was an example of how, I'd loved stories about how the world was created, and so I wanted to turn those stories into something that language learners could enjoy. So the National Teaching Fellowship really came out of, I think, that join between who I was, who I authentically was as a writer, and so from childhood, to how I had brought that authenticity into being a teacher, and to then showing how that had an impact on learners right through from children to adults.
And you mentioned authenticity. Do you think creativity is a way to get to the heart of the authentic learning experience and the lives of the learners?
Yeah, I think creativity can be a difficult word. It can be a word that worries people. It can be more worrying than it's worth. So obviously I don't rather think, how can I be creative, but I rather ask exactly that. How can I bring from learners what they really want to say, and give them a vehicle for doing that? So in answer to that, I would say yes, and the fact that happens to be creative, or the word creative can apply to it, is the sort of then happens next. But what happens first is, how can this learning really engage the learner? And so there are many educators outside the TESOL field, like Peter Abbs, Carl Rogers, who are in agreement with me. It's really a Ted Ragg, and these are some of my educational heroes, Ken Robinson, who are really saying the same, that to deeply learn something, you have to be engaging with what you really want to say and what you really want to learn. And for me, that spark is what I've been trying to find, and that can be called creativity, but that's just a word.
I see.
It's a shorthand word.
Right. Okay, so yeah, you mentioned creativity, and in the classroom there are a number of ways for learners to kind of generate those ideas. I wonder if you could give some examples about the best way to get that response from learners.
I mean, obviously, best doesn't fit with what I'm saying about, the sensitivity to the individual learners. But sort of an example is that, say with beginners or with this is something I've done with learners at all levels, is to work with the idea of praise, and what is it or who is it that you most want to praise or thank or celebrate, to focus on that person or thing. Could be an animal, a pet, an object, a person, a relation, somebody you love who's close to you. And we work with metaphor to write praise poems, and so they can be very, very simple metaphors. My father is a rock, and that can grow to being something much bigger. So right from the start, you're dealing with a very personal and authentic emotion, and you're giving learners from very little English to poets a vehicle for talking about that. So I think that journey is one that I'm always interested to ask. So, for example, with master's level students, we always open our first sessions by looking at the peak moments, the trough moments that have brought them into teaching, to share the moments of despair and to analyse why they were and what has kept them and sustained them in the profession, and then to identify what the values were that drove that. So that's a sort of more sophisticated version of what I've just described, but it is in fact the same core principle, which is what really matters, what is unique to your experience that can help to throw light on for teachers why you're in the profession and what matters and what drives you and what do you share with others and what's unique to your own experience.
I see. And if the teachers ask that of themselves, that will then filter down to the learners.
Yes, and we then so then going back to the teachers, I always work with a meaningful development of reflection. I mean, I really look at what reflection really means. It's not just a mantra, a higher education mantra. It's actually, what does it look like? What do you do with it? And how can you then use that same principle of using language to describe real needs and real questions? How can you turn that? How can you make that happen for learners?
Right, I see.
So then model that. I then show that this comes from my own experience as a writer and wanting to bring into the classroom what helped me to become a writer.
I see.
So I do this right through to doctoral level. So I work with doctoral educators and run a 3-year doctoral writing program. And so we start by asking, who are the audiences you want to talk to that you haven't yet spoken to? And who are the audiences you have spoken to, and why? Why have you spoken to them? What is it you've wanted to say? And through that framing, it's possible to scaffold for them the move from writing as a teacher, writing as a practitioner, to writing as a teacher researcher. So they arrive at that change not simply by following the rhetoric of being a researcher, but by really looking at, why do I want to do this? What is the research question what is the way I wish to turn my practice into a research question that talks to a wider audience and has a bigger impact? So, I mean, in a way, what I'm sort of explaining is the development of sophistication from primary school children drawing pictures of my father as a rock, right through to doctoral educators becoming published in their field and writing as researchers for the first time.
So there's a link throughout.
It's a join, yeah.
Right. I guess that ties back to our original question about the links between the kind of the multiple literacies that exist in the world these days and in the classroom. It's kind of a very similar link, I guess, understanding those types of English, I guess.
Yeah. And I think, so I've said about a meaningful use of the term reflection, and I think the reason I say that is because I've done all of these kinds of writing, and what makes them join up is because I think really hard about, hold on, what's the difference, between writing a novel, so I've written a novel which is not for language learners, versus writing language learner literature. What's the difference?
Yeah.
Then I've written language learner literature, but also many academic papers and chapters. So what's the difference between those? What do I feel about that difference? And do other writers feel that difference too? So it's...
What are those?
And what are the differences? Yeah. So that's a project that I'm involved in the moment, is talking to our fellow professionals who write across these different divides as well, who are also poets and TESOL writers. So Alan Moley, Charlie Hadfield, David Hill have all been part of my research group, and so I've just put a chapter together. But that's a really interesting question, because I see them reflecting on these divides and in different ways and throwing different lights on that. Yeah. And for me, the only way that I've been able to arrive at what I call kind of poetry pedagogy is because I've reflected on these ways of writing, different ways of writing.
And that was something I wanted to ask. That was the first time I've come across that term. I wonder if you could kind of unpack that, what that term means a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, it's placing poetry at the centre, which we rarely do, and TESOL rarely does, and most professions don't. And I mean, in literature teaching, so I've worked with Sue Dimmock at the University of Leicester, who's ran a wonderful project called Poetry Matters, where she has been interrogating with educators in mother tongue English, why does poetry matter, why put it at the centre, and how. But so I'm asking the same question in language education, and the reason I'm asking that is because I think it's small enough to be achievable in terms of time and space. It looks different to other kinds of writing, so it creates an artifact that's memorable and that's permanent and that somehow encapsulates a feeling or a moment in a way that an essay doesn't, or even a long prose piece doesn't, which will give learners a sense of achievement and a sense of communicating at another level very directly. So I've interrogated that very specifically, and how it can then work inside a language curriculum. And what is unique to the pedagogy of teaching a poem as opposed to teaching writing in general or teaching prose in general. And again, the reason I've done that is because I work with poets all the time. I'm in about 3 or 4 different poetry groups, and I've run one in my home for 15 years.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
And we're all practicing poets, and virtually all of us have had collections published in the time we've been together. And we're always asking, is this a poem? Why? Why does it matter? Why should we say it this way? And so I'm applying the same strategies in language classrooms too.
And does part of this approach involve kind of instructing the learners how to write, the how of writing poetry too? Or is the form a bit looser in that sense?
In some ways, I mean, certainly in my book, Creative Poetry Writing, it's actually quite structured. And it doesn't worry about the terms creativity or poetry at all. It provides frameworks which make the learner leap leap into sort of, creative and imaginative ways of talking about what they feel. In ways that are poetic, happen to be poetic. So, for example, repetition of lines, like I remember, refrains, choosing lines that have a resonance and repeating them. So, sentence patterns, looking at rhymes and building those in, which happen to be poetic, but we don't worry about the ways of labelling that.
There was one section where you were using functional language in poetry.
Yeah.
So something that's completely kind of something we need for everyday communication, but putting that into a poem, I thought that was quite a nice idea.
Yeah, so there are two things about that. One is the idea of the found poem, which is that, out in the world, there are all kinds of chunks of language which we can draw attention to and ask questions about. And it draws attention both to itself and to its meaning. So, for example, signs and instructions and labels we can ask questions about, and then by subverting them, we're creating something new with them. So I would say, sort of, if we're looking at definitions of creativity, I would just say it's about creating something new. And of poetry, it's about drawing attention to itself, drawing attention to its language, creating something new with language. That is meaningful and that is there for a reason. So an example I think that I used in my book was that the returns form on an item that you want to send back has this form at the back which says, I'm returning this because it's too big, too short, wrong colour, wrong texture, wrong price.
That sounds poetic already.
And it sounds poetic, but then if you change the title and say it's about being redundant, which is what I did, it's about losing your job and redundancy, that same text becomes a metaphor for being rejected. So, and it can capture something that's meaningful. So that's...
So the learners, for the learners, that takes on a... I'll start that again, sorry. So for the learners, that kind of takes on a deeper meaning rather than simply the language itself.
That's right.
They're considering them.
Absolutely.
Underlying.
So it has that factor of you create something new with it by changing its context and you make it meaningful for yourself. So another example where when we went along the coast in Cornwall, in England, near where I live, and made a list of the signs which said things like, do not leave litter, do not feed seagulls, do not ride your bicycle, do not play games here, do not, and it seemed an example of how the nature is being co-opted and made corporate. Then working with those authentic signs, just grow the signs to make them increasingly bizarre, to show up the fact that our right to our own coastline has been taken away.
I see. And perhaps just maybe just to end, what advice would you give language teachers who perhaps have this? I guess they have this feeling that I'm not a creative person, and they, like you said before, they get kind of scared or put off by this term. What kind of advice would you give that teacher, for example, who maybe would like to get more creative, as it were, or use these ideas?
First of all, as I said, I think the term creative frightens people, and it's not then useful if it frightens people. But if you ask people, do you say something that's unique to yourself every day, or do you only imitate what other people say? Do you have thoughts and feelings which are personal to yourself? Do you want to express those? Do you want your learners to express those? Do you think they have something that's unique and personal to say? Do you see language in the world every day that you find funny, amusing, interesting, surprising? And if the answer to any of those is yes, then that is what it is to be a creative person. We are creative all the time in the way we use language.
Yeah.
It's just that we find the word frightening, and we think that it belongs only to geniuses and you have to have a special talent, but actually it's what we do all the time with language. And so it's just having the confidence to see that and to bring that into the classroom. Yeah, and I think it's sort of it's Carl Rogers' congruence with yourself and being the teacher that you are, being the person that you are in the classroom.
Right.
If you feel strongly, that you like to celebrate the good things in your life, why not create a context of praise and bring that into the classroom, for example? Why not praise the things you really care about in your personal life? Why just stay with the things that are in the course book? For example, if you're worried about things in your everyday street or in your city or in your local environment, and you find signs or changes worrying or funny or surprising, why not bring those into the classroom?
I see, Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time. It's been a fascinating interview. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jane Spiro, for talking to us. We hope you enjoyed the interview. If you would like to get in touch with us for any reason, our email is teflology@gmail.com. We also have a website, teflology-podcast.com, which has all of our previous episodes and forums. You can leave comments, ask questions, anything like that. Please follow us on Twitter, which is @teflology. And we also have a Facebook page that you can like, the TEFLology Facebook page, basically. So thank you very much, and we'll be back next time with a regular episode. Goodbye.